Everyone walked past the blind man until poor black girl saved him, unaware he's a billionaire. The autumn wind carried the scent of fried onions and desperation through downtown Chicago as 17-year-old Alina Rodriguez wiped her grease-stained hands on her apron for the last time that evening. Her shift at Murphy's Diner had been brutal. 8 hours of dodging wandering hands from truckers and forcing smiles at customers who left 50-cent tips on $20 bills. "You heading out, honey?" called Murphy from behind the grill, his Irish accent still thick after 30 years in America. "Mind yourself on the way home. Streets ain't safe for young girls these days." Alina nodded, untying her apron with tired fingers. "Thanks, Murphy. See you tomorrow." The bell above the diner door chimed as she stepped into the cool October evening, her worn sneakers hitting the cracked sidewalk with familiar rhythm. 3 blocks away, her 8-year-old brother Jaden waited at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, probably glued to her ancient television, watching cartoons and trying to forget that their electricity had been shut off again. $47.30, she counted mentally, feeling the crumpled bills in her pocket. Barely enough to get the lights back on, and certainly not enough for groceries. Her second job at the all-night laundromat started in 2 hours, which meant she had just enough time to grab Jaden, heat up some canned soup on Mrs. Patterson's stove, and get him settled for the night. The crosswalk ahead buzzed with the evening rush, office workers in sharp suits clutching coffee cups, teenagers with backpacks slung over their shoulders, elderly folks moving carefully along the familiar routes they'd walked for decades. The traffic light cast everything in alternating waves of red and green, like some urban Christmas display that had lost its magic. That's when she saw him. An elderly man stood at the corner of 5th and Madison, his weathered hand gripping a white cane that trembled against the concrete. His clothes were clean but worn, a navy blue sweater with a small hole near the left elbow, gray slacks that had seen better days, and shoes that were polished but obviously old. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes, even though the sun had set an hour ago. But it wasn't his appearance that made Alina's heart clench, it was the way people moved around him like water around a stone, their eyes fixed on their phones or the distance ahead, as if he were invisible. The man took a tentative step forward as the walk signal began its electronic chirping. A businessman in an expensive coat nearly knocked him sideways, muttering something under his breath about obstacles. The elderly man stumbled, catching himself just before falling, his cane clattering against a fire hydrant. "Watch where you're going," snapped a woman in yoga pants, scrolling through her phone as she stepped around him without even looking up. Alina felt her stomach twist. She'd seen this before, the way people treated those they considered burdens, inconveniences in their perfectly scheduled lives. It reminded her too much of the way social workers looked at her and Jaden, like problems to be solved rather than people to be helped. The light was already beginning its countdown, 15 seconds left, and the old man was still only halfway across the 4-lane intersection. Cars were revving their engines, impatient drivers checking their watches and preparing to surge forward the moment the light changed. "Alina!" She turned to see Jaden running toward her, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. His dark hair was messy, and there was a suspicious purple stain on his school uniform shirt that looked suspiciously like grape juice. "Mrs. Patterson said you'd be here soon," he panted, reaching for her hand. "Can we get ice cream?" Tommy Williams got ice cream today, and he said his mom bought it because he got a gold star in math, and I got a gold star too, so maybe. "Jay, look." Alina pointed toward the intersection, where the elderly man had frozen in the middle of the street, clearly disoriented by the honking cars and shouting drivers. "We have to help him." Jaden's eyes widened as he took in the scene. At 8 years old, he possessed an intuitive understanding of injustice that sometimes surprised Alina. He'd learned early that the world could be cruel to those who were different, vulnerable, or simply in the way. "Why isn't anyone helping him?" he whispered, his small hand tightening around hers. "I don't know, baby. But we are." Alina didn't think. Thinking would have reminded her that she was already late, that she couldn't afford to miss even a minute of her laundromat shift, that getting involved in strangers' problems was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she dropped Jaden's hand and sprinted toward the intersection, her sneakers slapping against the asphalt. Sir, wait, she called out, reaching the man just as the light began to flash its final warning. Take my arm. I'll help you across. The elderly man turned toward her voice, and she caught a glimpse of surprise behind his dark glasses. Up close, she could see that his face was kind but tired, marked by lines that spoke of decades of laughter and sorrow. There was something almost regal about the way he carried himself, despite his obvious confusion. Thank you, he said, his voice warm and cultured, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. I seem to have gotten turned around. Alina guided him quickly across the remaining distance, Jaden running alongside them, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of doing something important. They reached the opposite sidewalk just as the light changed, cars rushing past in a blur of metal and exhaust. There you go, Alina said gently, making sure the man was steady on his feet. Are you okay? Do you need me to call someone? The man shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. No, my dear. You've done quite enough. More than enough. He paused, tilting his head slightly. What are your names? I'm Alina, and this is my little brother Jaden. Jaden, the man repeated, as if testing the name. He reached down and found Jaden's small hand, shaking it with the gravity reserved for important business deals. It's a pleasure to meet you both. I'm Henry. Henry Whitmore. Hi, Mr. Henry. Jaden said brightly. Do you live around here? We live in the apartments on 7th Street. They're not very nice, but Alina says we'll find something better someday. Jaden. Alina warned softly, embarrassed by her brother's honesty. But Henry chuckled. Hope is a wonderful thing to hold on to, young man. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the endless stream of people hurry past. Alina checked her phone. She had an hour and 45 minutes before her next shift. Barely enough time, but manageable. Well, she said finally, we should probably get going. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Henry. Will you be okay getting home? Something flickered across Henry's expression, so quickly she almost missed it. Oh yes, I'll manage. I always do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Please let me give you something for your kindness. No, Alina said quickly, perhaps too quickly. The word came out sharper than she intended. I mean, no thank you. We didn't help you because we wanted money. We helped because it was the right thing to do. Henry's smile widened, and for a moment, Alina could have sworn she saw him glance at her directly, as if he could see right through those dark glasses. But that was impossible, wasn't it? You're remarkable young people, he said finally. Both of you. This world needs more hearts like yours. As they began to walk away, Jaden turned back and waved enthusiastically. Bye, Grandpa Henry. Maybe we'll see you again. Henry raised his hand in return, and Alina could have sworn she heard him whisper. I certainly hope so. What none of them noticed was the sleek black BMW parked across the street, its engine running, windows tinted dark enough to hide the woman sitting behind the wheel. Victoria Whitmore's manicured fingers gripped the steering wheel as she watched the scene unfold, her lips pressed into a thin line of displeasure. She'd been following her uncle for 3 days, worried about his increasingly strange behavior. And now this, Henry giving his real name to some street kids, acting like a helpless old man when she knew perfectly well he could afford a driver, a bodyguard, anything he wanted. Victoria reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. She had work to do. 3 days later, the October chill had settled deeper into Chicago's bones. Alina pulled her thin jacket tighter as she and Jaden walked home from his school, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. She'd managed to get their electricity turned back on with her diner tips, but groceries were still a distant dream. The $23 in her pocket had to last until Friday's payday. Lena, look! Jaden tugged on her sleeve, pointing across the street. It's Grandpa Henry. Sure enough, there was the elderly man from 3 nights ago, standing at the same intersection where they'd first met him. But this time, he looked even more lost, turning his head from side to side as if listening for familiar sounds that never came. He looks confused, Jaden observed, his 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Maybe he's lost again. Alina hesitated. She was already running late for her afternoon shift at the laundromat, and Mrs. Patterson charged extra if she was late picking up Jaden from her apartment. But watching Henry stand there, clearly disoriented while people flowed around him like he was just another piece of street furniture, made her chest ache. "Come on," she said, taking Jaden's hand. "Let's go help him." They crossed the street, dodging between cars that honked impatiently at their presence. As they approached, Henry turned toward the sound of their footsteps, and his face brightened with what looked like genuine relief. "Alina? Jaden?" His voice carried a note of surprise that seemed almost practiced. "What are the chances of running into you again?" "Hi, Mr. Henry." Jaden bounced on his toes. "Are you lost? We can help you find your way home." "Well," Henry said slowly, "I was trying to get to the corner market. I heard they have fresh bread there, but these streets all sound the same to me." Alina glanced around. Milano's market was just 2 blocks away, a small family-run shop where she sometimes splurged on day-old pastries for Jaden's birthday or special occasions. The owner, Mrs. Milano, was kind enough to let items go cheap at closing time rather than throw them away. "We know exactly where that is," Alina said warmly. "Would you like us to walk you there?" "I would be most grateful." As they began walking, Jaden chattered away about his day at school, telling Henry about his spelling test and how his friend Marcus had brought a pet hamster for show and tell. Henry listened with the attention most adults reserve for important business meetings, asking questions and making appropriate comments that made Jaden beam with pride. "You're very good with children," Alina observed quietly as Jaden ran ahead to examine an interesting crack in the sidewalk. "Children see the world more clearly than adults do," Henry replied. "They haven't learned yet that kindness is supposed to be conditional." Something in his tone made Alina glance at him sharply, but his expression remained neutral behind those dark glasses. Milano's market was bustling with afternoon shoppers when they arrived. Mrs. Milano greeted Alina with a warm smile that dimmed slightly when she noticed they were with someone she didn't recognize. "Alina, cara mia, how are you? And little Jaden?" The elderly Italian woman's accent added music to her words. "You bring a friend today?" "This is Mr. Henry," Alina explained. "We're helping him shop for some bread." As Henry made his selections, expensive artisan loaves that made Alina's stomach growl with longing, she found herself studying the pastry case. There were apple turnovers that smelled like heaven, chocolate croissants that probably cost more than she made in tips some days, and small fruit tarts decorated like tiny works of art. Her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough for Jaden to hear. "Lena, are you hungry?" he asked innocently. "You didn't eat lunch again, did you?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "I'm fine, Jay. I had something earlier." The lie came easily, she'd been telling it for months. But Henry had turned toward them, his head tilted as if he were listening to something beyond their conversation. "Mrs. Milano," he said suddenly, "might I also have 3 of those apple turnovers? They smell wonderful." "Of course. My grandmother's recipe." "You have excellent taste, signore." At the register, Henry fumbled with his wallet, and several bills scattered on the floor. As Alina bent to help him collect them, she couldn't help but notice they were all hundreds, more money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. Her eyes widened, but she quickly gathered the bills and handed them back without comment. "Thank you, my dear," Henry said, accepting the change from Mrs. Milano. Then, turning to Alina and Jaden, he held out the small bakery bag. "Would you share these with me? I'm afraid I bought too many, and I hate to waste good food." "Oh, we couldn't," Alina began, but Jaden had already accepted the bag with the enthusiasm only an 8-year-old could muster. "Thank you, Grandpa Henry. These smell so good." Outside the market, they found a small bench where Jaden immediately dove into his turnover, getting flaky pastry all over his school uniform. Alina took small, careful bites of hers, savoring each morsel. It had been days since she'd eaten anything that wasn't from a can or the diner's leftover soup. "This is really generous of you, Mr. Henry," she said. "But we can't keep letting you buy us things." "You're not letting me do anything," Henry replied gently. "I'm choosing to share a simple pleasure with two people who've shown me extraordinary kindness. There's a difference." Jaden looked up from his turnover, his face smeared with apple filling. "Grandpa Henry, do you live all by yourself? You seem lonely sometimes." The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with innocent truth. Henry was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Alina hadn't noticed before. "Yes, Jaden. I do live alone. I have for quite some time now." "That's sad," Jaden declared with the matter-of-fact honesty of childhood. "Everyone needs a family. Alina takes care of me, and I take care of her too. We're a team." "A team," Henry repeated thoughtfully. "I like that." As they prepared to part ways, Jaden threw his small arms around Henry's waist in an impulsive hug. "See you again soon, Grandpa Henry." Henry's hand came to rest gently on Jaden's head, and for a moment, his composed expression cracked, revealing something that looked almost like longing. "I hope so, young man. I truly hope so." Across the street, partially hidden behind a newspaper stand, Victoria Whitmore lowered her phone. She'd captured several photos of the interaction, her lips curving into a cold smile. Uncle Henry was playing a dangerous game, but she was 3 steps ahead of him. After all, she had always been the smarter Whitmore. The Whitmore estate sat like a fortress on Chicago's Gold Coast, its limestone facade gleaming under perfectly manicured spotlights. Inside the grand foyer, beneath a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people made in a year, Victoria Whitmore paced across Italian marble floors, her Louboutin heels clicking in angry rhythm. She'd been waiting for Uncle Henry for 2 hours. The photographs from her phone were already printed and spread across the antique mahogany table in the sitting room, images of Henry with that ragged girl and her grubby little brother, sharing pastries, laughing together like some twisted family reunion. Each picture felt like a personal attack on everything she'd worked for. The sound of the front door's heavy locks disengaging made her freeze mid-step. Henry's voice drifted through the cavernous hallway as he spoke to Patterson, the elderly butler who'd served the Whitmore family for 40 years. "Good evening, sir." Patterson's formal British accent carried clearly. "I trust your afternoon walk was pleasant." "Indeed it was, Patterson. Quite enlightening, actually." Victoria smoothed her designer dress and arranged her expression into one of concerned affection. She'd perfected this look over the years, the devoted niece worried about her aging uncle's welfare. It had served her well with the family lawyers, the board members, and society photographers. Henry appeared in the doorway, still wearing those ridiculous dark glasses and carrying his white cane. In the warm light of the sitting room, his performance seemed almost insulting. Did he really think she was that naive? "Victoria, my dear." He moved carefully around the furniture, every gesture calculated to reinforce his helpless facade. "You're up rather late." "I was worried about you, Uncle Henry." She gestured toward the photographs scattered across the table. "We need to talk." Henry's steps faltered almost imperceptibly as he took in the images. If Victoria hadn't been watching so carefully, she would have missed the way his jaw tightened, the slight straightening of his shoulders. "I see you've been busy," he said mildly, settling into his favorite wingback chair, the one that had belonged to his father, and his father before him. "I've been protecting you." Victoria perched on the edge of the sofa, leaning forward with practiced concern. "Uncle Henry, do you have any idea what these people are doing to you? Enlighten me." The coolness in his voice should have warned her, but Victoria was too focused on her own agenda to notice. She snatched up the clearest photograph, the one showing Alina helping Henry collect his scattered money. "Look at this girl, Uncle Henry. Really look at her. She's practically a child herself, living in some slum with that little boy, working minimum-wage jobs." Victoria's voice took on the tone she used with slow children and senile relatives. "Don't you think it's awfully convenient that she keeps finding you when you're vulnerable?" Henry was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. What exactly are you suggesting, Victoria? I'm suggesting that this girl, Alina, has figured out that you have money. She's playing on your sympathies, using that little brother as bait to make you feel sorry for them. Victoria stood and began pacing again, warming to her theme. These people are predators, Uncle Henry. They target elderly individuals, especially those with disabilities, and slowly manipulate them into handing over their assets. You seem to know quite a lot about this particular form of manipulation. Something in his tone made Victoria pause, but she pressed on. I've done my research. There are entire networks of these scammers working the city. They probably followed you home from one of your medical appointments, figured out where you live, and now they're running a long con. Henry removed his dark glasses and cleaned them slowly with a silk handkerchief, a gesture Victoria had seen him make thousands of times when he was thinking. Even now, maintaining his charade, he avoided direct eye contact. Tell me, Victoria, he said finally, in all these photographs you've taken, do you see any evidence of these alleged manipulations? Any demands for money? Any inappropriate behavior? Victoria faltered. The truth was, the photographs showed nothing more sinister than an elderly man sharing pastries with 2 children. But she'd learned long ago that truth was less important than perception. It's not about what's happening now, she said, switching tactics. It's about what they're building toward. These scams take months to develop. They gain your trust first, make you emotionally dependent on them, and then they start making requests. Small ones at first. Help with rent, medical bills, school supplies for the brother. Before you know it, you're funding their entire lives. And you believe this is what's happening to me? Uncle Henry. Victoria moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hand in both of hers. Her voice dropped to a whisper, the perfect picture of a concerned family member. I know you've been lonely since Aunt Margaret passed. I know you miss having young people in your life. But these aren't the right people. They're not safe. For the first time since she'd started talking, Henry looked directly at her. The intensity in his pale blue eyes was startling, as if he could see straight through her carefully constructed performance to the calculating mind beneath. What would you have me do? He asked quietly. Victoria felt a surge of triumph. She had him. Stay away from them. I'll have Patterson drive you anywhere you need to go. No more of these dangerous solo walks. And if they try to contact you, we'll involve the police. There are laws against elder abuse, Uncle Henry. We can protect you. Henry replaced his glasses and reached for his cane. When he stood, there was something different about his posture, straighter somehow, more commanding. But then he stumbled slightly against the coffee table, and Victoria dismissed the impression. I'll consider what you've said, he told her. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't see them again without talking to me first. Henry paused in the doorway, his back to her. I promise you, Victoria, that I will handle this situation appropriately. After he left, Victoria gathered up the photographs, her mind already racing ahead to the next phase of her plan. Uncle Henry was stubborn, but he wasn't stupid. Given time, he'd see reason. And if he didn't, well, there were other ways to protect the family fortune. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Marcus Cole, a private investigator she'd used before for delicate family matters. If Uncle Henry wouldn't listen to reason about that girl, perhaps it was time to give the girl herself some reasons to stay away. After all, people like Alina Rodriguez had so much to lose. A girl raising her little brother alone, working multiple jobs, probably with all kinds of legal vulnerabilities Victoria could exploit. It shouldn't be too difficult to convince her that associating with the Whitmore family was more trouble than it was worth. Victoria smiled as she dialed. Uncle Henry always said she had inherited the family talent for business. He had no idea how right he was. Over the next week, Henry Whitmore became as much a part of Alina and Jaden's routine as checking the mailbox for overdue bills or counting loose change for the bus. Every afternoon, without fail, he appeared somewhere in their neighborhood, sometimes at the crosswalk where they'd first met, other times near Milano's market, and once memorably outside Jaden's school, looking helplessly confused by the maze of yellow buses and chattering children. It's like he's a lost puppy, Jaden announced on Thursday afternoon as they spotted Henry standing uncertainly outside the public library, his white cane tapping nervously against the concrete steps. But a really nice lost puppy who smells like expensive soap. Alina couldn't help but smile at her brother's assessment. There was something almost endearing about Henry's apparent inability to navigate their neighborhood, especially considering how well-spoken and sophisticated he seemed in every other way. She'd begun to suspect he might be suffering from the early stages of dementia. It would explain the confusion, the repeated getting lost, and the way he sometimes seemed to forget conversations they'd had just days before. "Mr. Henry!" Jaden called out, waving enthusiastically as they approached. "Are you lost again?" Henry's face brightened as he turned toward their voices. "Ah, my young friends! I'm afraid I am indeed having a bit of trouble. I thought I might visit the library to listen to some audiobooks, but—" He gestured helplessly at the imposing brick building with its grand columns and multiple entrances. "The main entrance is just around the corner," Alina explained gently, taking his arm. "It can be confusing from this side." As they walked, Jaden launched into an animated recap of his day, complete with dramatic reenactments of his encounter with the class bully, Tommy Williams, and his triumph in the spelling bee. Henry listened with the focused attention of someone truly interested, asking follow-up questions that made Jaden glow with importance. "You spelled magnificent correctly?" Henry asked, sounding genuinely impressed. "That's a challenging word for someone your age." "I practiced with Alina every night for a week," Jaden said proudly. "She makes up stories with the words so I remember them better." Like the magnificent elephant was definitely confident in his intelligence. "Your sister sounds like an excellent teacher." Something in Henry's tone made Alina glance at him. Even behind those dark glasses, she could sense he was studying her, though she couldn't imagine why. Inside the library, Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, greeted them with warm recognition. "Alina, Jaden! How nice to see you! And you've brought a friend? This is Mr. Henry," Alina explained. "He was looking for audiobooks." "Wonderful! Right this way, sir." As Mrs. Chen led Henry toward the audio collection, explaining the library's system in patient detail, Jaden wandered off to the children's section. Alina found herself watching Henry carefully as he navigated between the shelves, his movements surprisingly graceful for someone supposedly struggling with blindness and confusion. There was something almost practiced about the way he held his cane, she realized. Not the hesitant, tentative movements she'd seen from other visually impaired patrons, but something more deliberate. When Mrs. Chen handed him a cassette case to examine, his fingers traced the text with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "Alina?" Henry's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Might I ask you a favor?" "Of course." He held up several audiobook cases. "I'm afraid I can't quite make out all the details on these. Would you mind reading the descriptions to me? I'm looking for something uplifting. Something about people overcoming difficult circumstances through kindness and determination." As Alina read through the book summaries, she found herself drawn into conversation about literature, philosophy, and the kinds of stories that made life bearable during hard times. Henry's insights were thoughtful and nuanced, revealing a depth of education that seemed at odds with his simple clothes and apparent circumstances. "You have excellent taste in books," she said finally. "Have you always been a reader?" "My late wife was the real reader in our family," Henry replied, his voice softening. "Margaret could spend entire weekends lost in novels. After she passed, I found that audiobooks helped fill some of the silence in the house." The grief in his voice was unmistakable, and Alina felt her heart clench with sympathy. She'd lost her parents when she was 15, and she recognized that particular quality of sadness, the kind that became part of you, like a scar that ached in cold weather. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "Thank you, my dear. Margaret would have liked you both very much. She always said that kindness was the most important quality a person could possess." When they finally left the library, Henry carrying his selection of audiobooks in a canvas bag Alina had helped him choose, Jaden was practically bouncing with excitement. Mr. Henry, do you want to see where we live? It's not very fancy, but Alina made it really nice inside, and we have a pretty good view of the fire escape. Alina felt her cheeks burn. Jaden, Mr. Henry probably needs to get home. Actually, Henry interrupted gently, I would be honored to see your home, if it wouldn't be too much trouble. The walk to their apartment building took them through increasingly shabby neighborhoods, past boarded-up storefronts and graffiti-covered walls. Alina found herself acutely aware of the contrast between Henry's obvious refinement and their surroundings. She braced herself for judgment, for the subtle withdrawals she'd seen in teachers' faces when they visited for parent conferences. Instead, Henry seemed genuinely interested in everything Jaden pointed out: the corner where they sometimes bought ice cream from Mr. Rodriguez's cart, the mural painted by local high school students, the small community garden where Mrs. Patterson grew tomatoes in the summer. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. As they climbed the narrow stairs, Alina apologized for the broken elevator, the peeling paint, and the lingering smell of someone's burned dinner. Every home tells a story, Henry said simply. The size of the rooms matter far less than the size of the hearts that fill them. Inside their small 2-bedroom apartment, Alina watched nervously as Henry took in their second-hand furniture, the stack of library books on the coffee table, and Jaden's artwork taped to the refrigerator. But his expression remained kind, interested, and completely free of the pity she'd expected. This is beautiful, he said, running his fingers along the edge of a hand-sewn quilt draped over their worn couch. Did you make this? My grandmother taught me before she passed, Alina admitted. It's not perfect, but it's made with love, Henry finished. That makes it perfect. As the afternoon wore on, Henry settled into their small living room as if he belonged there. He listened to Jaden read aloud from his favorite picture book, offered to help Alina fold laundry, an offer she politely declined, and shared stories about his own childhood that had both children laughing until their sides ached. When it was time for him to leave, Jaden threw his arms around Henry's waist in their now customary goodbye hug. Will we see you tomorrow, Grandpa Henry? I certainly hope so, Henry replied, his hand resting gently on Jaden's head. If I can manage not to get lost again. As Alina walked him to the door, Henry paused. Thank you, he said quietly. For your kindness, your patience, and for sharing your home with me. You've given an old man more joy in these past few days than he's felt in years. After he left, Alina found herself wondering about the sadness that seemed to shadow Henry despite his obvious pleasure in their company. There was something almost desperate in the way he clung to their friendship, as if he were starving for exactly the kind of uncomplicated affection that came so naturally to Jaden. She had no way of knowing that 3 blocks away, Marcus Cole was photographing Henry as he walked toward the expensive part of town, or that Victoria Whitmore was already reviewing the private investigator's preliminary report on one Alina Rodriguez, a report that detailed her parents' deaths, her struggles with child services, and several minor legal vulnerabilities that could be easily exploited by someone with enough money and malicious intent. The trap was being set, and none of them saw it coming. Mr. Benjamin Cole had lived in the same apartment building as Alina and Jaden for 3 years, and in all that time, he'd never given them more than a grudging nod in the hallway. A retired postal worker with thinning gray hair and a permanent scowl, he'd always viewed his younger neighbors with the suspicion reserved for anyone who might disturb his carefully ordered world. So when the well-dressed woman knocked on his door that Friday evening, offering him $50 to keep an eye on that Rodriguez girl and her activities with the elderly gentleman, Cole's interest was immediately piqued. I'm not asking you to spy, Victoria Whitmore explained, her voice smooth as silk as she handed him the crisp bills. I'm simply concerned about my uncle's welfare. He's been showing signs of confusion lately, and I worry that certain people might be taking advantage of his condition. Cole pocketed the money without hesitation. $50 would cover his cable bill for the month, and all he had to do was pay attention to something he'd already been curious about anyway. That Rodriguez girl had been bringing some old blind man around the building for weeks now, and it did seem odd that someone so well-spoken would be spending time in their rundown neighborhood. What exactly am I looking for? he asked. Anything unusual? Extended visits, exchanges of money, discussions about financial matters. My uncle is quite wealthy, Mr. Cole, and I've seen far too many cases of vulnerable elderly people being manipulated by those who pretend to care about them. After Victoria left, Cole found himself studying his neighbors with new eyes. The next afternoon, when he saw Alina and Jaden returning from the library with the old man in tow, he positioned himself by his window to observe their interactions. When Henry lingered in their apartment for over 2 hours, Cole made a note of it. When he saw Alina walking Henry to the corner, and watching until he was safely out of sight, Cole noted that too. Within days, his observations had taken on the quality of fact in his mind. The Rodriguez girl was clearly running some kind of scheme, and he was the neighborhood's first line of defense against it. You know, he mentioned casually to Mrs. Patterson while collecting his mail, I've been seeing that Rodriguez girl with some old blind fellow quite a bit lately. Seems odd, doesn't it? Girl her age taking such an interest in a stranger? Mrs. Patterson, who'd been watching Jaden after school for months and had nothing but good things to say about both children, frowned. Alina's a sweet girl, Mr. Cole. If she's helping someone, I'm sure her intentions are good. Oh, I'm not saying they aren't, Cole replied, his tone suggesting the opposite. It's just that these days, you never know who you can trust. Especially when money's involved. The seed planted, Cole moved on to other neighbors. At the corner laundromat where Alina worked her second job, he struck up conversations with other customers, casually mentioning this situation, with the girl and the wealthy old man. His version of events grew more detailed with each telling. He'd seen expensive gifts being exchanged, overheard conversations about financial problems, witnessed behavior that seemed inappropriate for a young girl and an elderly gentleman. Mrs. Garcia from the second floor was the first to bite. I always wondered how that girl managed to keep the lights on, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Those jobs of hers can't pay much, and she's got that little brother to feed. Exactly my point, Cole replied. Makes you think, doesn't it? Within a week, the whispers had spread through their building like wildfire. The story evolved with each telling, gaining details that Cole had never mentioned, accusations that grew more serious with every repetition. Alina Rodriguez was taking advantage of a confused old man. She was stealing from him. She was planning something bigger, something that would leave the poor fellow penniless and alone. The worst part was how the gossip affected Jaden. At school, children could be cruel in ways that adults had forgotten, and it didn't take long for the rumors to reach Lincoln Elementary. During lunch on Tuesday, Tommy Williams, the same boy who'd bullied Jaden about his second-hand clothes and free lunch tickets, cornered him by the monkey bars. My mom says your sister's a thief, Tommy announced loudly enough for the nearby children to hear. She says she's stealing money from some old blind guy. That's not true, Jaden protested, his small hands balling into fists. Alina would never steal anything. She's good. Then why is she hanging around with some rich old man? Another child chimed in. My dad says poor people only do that when they want something. She's helping him because he's lost. Jaden's voice cracked with frustration and tears. She helps people because that's what good people do. But the other children had already made up their minds, and Jaden found himself increasingly isolated during recess, eating lunch alone, and walking home by himself because his former friends weren't allowed to play with the thief's brother anymore. At home, Alina began to notice the changes. The way conversations stopped when she entered the laundromat, the suspicious glances from neighbors she'd known for years, the cold shoulders from parents at Jaden's school pickup. She couldn't understand what had changed, what she'd done wrong to deserve this sudden shift in attitude. The breaking point came on Thursday evening when she returned from work to find "Thief" spray-painted across their apartment door in angry red letters. Her hands shook as she tried to scrub it off with a bucket of soapy water and an old rag, tears streaming down her face as she realized that someone, multiple someones, believed she was capable of something so horrible. Lena? Jaden's small voice came from behind her. He'd been waiting in Mrs. Patterson's apartment, but the elderly babysitter had apparently let him return early. Why does it say that? What does it mean? Alina turned around, taking in her brother's confused and frightened expression, and felt something break inside her chest. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that their neighbors believed lies about her? How could she make him understand that sometimes people preferred ugly stories to beautiful truths? It means someone made a mistake, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Someone who doesn't know us very well thinks something that isn't true. Is it about Grandpa Henry? Jaden asked quietly. Are people mad because we're friends with him? The innocent question hit Alina like a physical blow. In all their time together, it had never occurred to her that their friendship with Henry might be perceived as anything other than what it was, simple human kindness. But now, seeing the situation through hostile eyes, she could understand how it might look suspicious. A poor teenage girl, a little brother to support, and a wealthy elderly man who seemed to appear whenever they needed help most. Maybe, she admitted. Some people don't understand that you can be friends with someone just because you like them. That night, as Jaden slept fitfully in their shared bedroom, Alina sat at their small kitchen table and stared at the stack of bills that seemed to have grown larger since morning. The rent notice was marked final, and she had exactly 4 days to come up with $600 or they'd be evicted. Murphy's Diner and the laundromat had both called that afternoon. Neither conversation had gone well. Look, Alina, Murphy had said, his Irish accent thick with discomfort. You know I think you're a good kid. But I got customers asking questions, you know? About whether it's safe to have someone with your situation handling their food. The laundromat owner had been more direct. I can't have drama in my business. Find somewhere else to work. 2 jobs lost in 1 day. Even if she found new employment immediately, it would take weeks to see a paycheck, and landlords weren't known for their patience with sob stories about false accusations. Alina put her head in her hands and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to give up. To pack their few belongings, take Jaden, and disappear into the vast anonymity of another city where no one knew their names or their story. They could start fresh, build new lives away from the poisonous whispers and hostile stares. But running would mean abandoning everything they'd built here, meager as it was. It would mean leaving Mrs. Patterson, who'd become like a grandmother to Jaden. It would mean giving up the small community they'd carved out for themselves, the familiar streets and friendly faces that had made this place feel like home. Most importantly, it would mean letting Victoria Whitmore win. The thought struck her like lightning, sudden and illuminating. This wasn't random bad luck or a series of unfortunate coincidences. Someone had orchestrated this destruction, the perfectly timed appearance of that elegant woman at the market, the wallet planted in her bag, the coordinated cruelty of the accusations. Someone wanted her gone, wanted her discredited and humiliated. But why? As she sat in the darkness of her small kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of their building settling around her, Alina made a decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. And she sure as hell wouldn't let anyone take Jaden away from her. She would fight back. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was fighting against. And that meant finding out who Victoria Whitmore really was, and why she'd gone to such elaborate lengths to destroy a teenage girl she'd never met. The game wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. 3 floors above, Mr. Cole reported his latest observations to Victoria Whitmore over the phone, adding colorful details about the girl's obvious distress and the community's growing hostility. He'd earned an extra $100 this week, and Victoria had promised even more if he could document any direct evidence of financial manipulation. You're doing excellent work, Victoria told him. Keep watching. I suspect our little thief is going to make a mistake very soon. Saturday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made Chicago beautiful, but Alina barely noticed as she walked toward Milano's market with Henry and Jaden. The past week had been a nightmare of whispered conversations and hostile stares, and she'd seriously considered telling Henry that they couldn't be friends anymore. But when she'd seen him that morning, standing confused at their usual corner with a small smile lighting up his face at the sound of their voices, she couldn't bring herself to break an old man's heart. I thought we might pick up ingredients for a proper meal. Henry had suggested. Something we could cook together, if that would be all right. Now, as they approached the market, Alina noticed how the usual Saturday crowd seemed to part around them, conversation stopping mid-sentence as neighbors she'd known for years turned away or stared with undisguised suspicion. Mrs. Garcia from her building actually crossed the street rather than walk past them. "Why is everyone acting so weird?" Jaden whispered, his small hand tightening around Alina's. Before she could answer, Henry placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people react strangely to things they don't understand," he said quietly. "The important thing is that we know the truth about ourselves." Inside Milano's market, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mrs. Milano greeted them with her usual warmth, but Alina could see other customers watching their every move, whispering behind displays of vegetables and canned goods. She tried to focus on Henry's cheerful commentary as he selected ingredients for what sounded like an elaborate pasta dish, but the weight of so many hostile eyes made her skin crawl. They were standing in the produce section, Jaden helping Henry choose tomatoes, when Victoria Whitmore made her entrance. She swept into the market like a force of nature, her designer coat and perfectly styled hair marking her as someone from a different world entirely. Conversation stopped as she passed, and Alina felt a chill of recognition even though she was certain they'd never met. There was something about the woman's predatory grace, the way she moved through the store with obvious purpose, that set every alarm bell in Alina's head ringing. "Uncle Henry." Victoria's voice cut through the market's ambient noise like a blade. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." Henry stiffened beside Elena, his fingers tightening around the tomato he was holding. "Victoria. What a surprise. I told you not to wander off without Patterson." Victoria continued, her tone mixing affection with reproach in a way that made Elena's stomach turn. "You know how worried I get when you disappear like this." The small crowd that had gathered was now openly staring, and Alina could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. This elegant, wealthy woman was clearly related to Henry, and her obvious concern painted their friendship in an entirely new light. "I'm perfectly fine, my dear," Henry said carefully. "I was just shopping with my friends." "Friends?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Uncle Henry, these people aren't your friends. Look around you. Look at where we are." She gestured dismissively at the modest market, at the working-class shoppers, at Alina herself. "This isn't appropriate for someone in your condition." "My condition?" Henry's voice carried a warning note that Alina had never heard before. "Your confusion, Uncle Henry. Your memory problems." Victoria's voice grew louder, ensuring that everyone in the market could hear every word. "Dr. Matthews warned us this might happen, that you might become disoriented, might trust the wrong people." Alina felt heat flood her cheeks. "Excuse me, but we're not." "Oh, aren't you?" Victoria turned toward her with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Tell me, dear, what exactly are you getting out of this friendship with my uncle?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Every person in the market was now watching, waiting for her answer, and Alina could see the suspicion on their faces crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. "Nothing," she said quietly. "We don't want anything from Mr. Henry except his friendship." "How noble," Victoria purred. "And yet here you are, taking a confused elderly man shopping, handling his money, influencing his decisions." She trailed off, letting the implications sink in. "That's not what's happening," Alina protested, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out Henry's leather wallet. "Then perhaps you can explain how my uncle's wallet ended up in your bag?" The market fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and someone's sharp intake of breath. Alina stared at the wallet in horror, then at her own tote bag, which Victoria was now holding up for everyone to see. "That's impossible," Alina whispered. "I didn't. I would never." But Victoria had already opened the tote bag, and there, nestled between Alina's library books and Jaden's homework folder, was an identical leather wallet. "Uncle Henry?" Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. Do you remember giving your wallet to this young lady? Henry stood frozen, his face pale behind his dark glasses. Alina turned to him desperately, waiting for him to explain, to tell everyone that this was some kind of mistake. But he remained silent, and that silence felt like a knife through her heart. I didn't take it, Alina said louder, her voice cracking with desperation. I don't know how it got there. Someone must have put it there? Victoria finished. How convenient. The classic excuse of every thief caught red-handed. Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who'd been ringing up groceries at the next register, stepped forward with surprising firmness. Now wait just a minute, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through enough nonsense to recognize it when she saw it. I've known Alina Rodriguez for 2 years, and she's never taken so much as a penny that wasn't hers. This girl works 2 jobs to support her little brother, and she's got more integrity in her pinky finger than most people have in their whole bodies. Several other customers murmured agreement, but their voices were drowned out by the louder chorus of suspicion. Someone called out, I heard she's been scamming that old man for weeks. Another voice added, My neighbor saw her going through his pockets. The crowd was turning ugly, feeding off each other's outrage and Victoria's carefully planted suggestions. Faces that had been merely curious were now hostile, angry, ready for blood. Please, Alina said, looking desperately around the circle of accusers. Please, you all know me. Mrs. Milano, you've known me since I was in high school. You know I wouldn't do this. Mrs. Milano looked torn, glancing between Alina's tear-streaked face and the evidence of the wallet. Alina, Cara, she said sadly. I don't know what to think. That's when Jaden stepped forward, his 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult chaos with perfect clarity. My sister didn't steal anything, he shouted, tears streaming down his face. She's good. She's the best person in the whole world. You're all being mean and stupid. The sight of Jaden defending her while the adults she trusted turned their backs broke something inside Alina. She grabbed her brother's hand and pushed through the crowd toward the exit, ignoring the catcalls and accusations that followed in their wake. Stop them! Someone shouted. Call the police! But Alina was already through the door and running, Jaden's small legs struggling to keep pace as they fled down the street, leaving Henry standing alone in the market with his niece's triumphant smile and a crowd of neighbors who now believed the worst of the girl who had shown him nothing but kindness. Behind them, Victoria pocketed the wallet she'd planted in Alina's bag earlier that morning, already planning her next move. The ride back to the Whitmore estate was suffocating. Victoria sat in the driver's seat of her BMW, practically glowing with satisfaction as she recounted every detail of the morning's performance to Henry, who remained silent in the passenger seat, his hands clenched tightly around his white cane. Did you see the look on that girl's face? Victoria laughed, her voice bright with malicious glee. I thought she might actually faint when I pulled out the wallet. And that little brother of hers, crying and screaming like that, honestly, Uncle Henry, you should be grateful I saved you from such a scene. Henry said nothing, but behind his dark glasses, his jaw was set in a hard line that Victoria was too pleased with herself to notice. The beauty of it is that everyone saw. She continued, taking the turn into their gated community. Mrs. Milano, the Garcias, that dreadful Mr. Cole, they all witnessed her humiliation firsthand. By tomorrow, the entire neighborhood will know exactly what kind of person Alina Rodriguez really is. At the mention of Mr. Cole's name, Henry's head turned slightly. Cole? Oh yes, he's been extraordinarily helpful. A retired postal worker who lives in their building, very observant, very concerned about community safety. He's been documenting the girl's behavior for weeks. Victoria pulled into their circular driveway, the gravel crunching under the BMW's expensive tires. For a modest fee, of course. Amazing how civic-minded people become when there's a little financial incentive involved. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Henry's mind. The gradual shift in neighborhood attitudes, the increasingly hostile stares, the way people had begun crossing the street to avoid them. It hadn't been organic suspicion at all. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign. Inside the mansion, Victoria poured herself a glass of champagne from the bar cart in the sitting room, her movements quick and energetic with the rush of victory. I have to admit, Uncle Henry, for a while there I was worried you might actually be developing feelings for those people. The way you kept disappearing to visit them, spending hours in that dreadful apartment, it was almost like you were starting to care about them. Henry removed his dark glasses and set them carefully on the mantelpiece, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he turned to face Victoria, his pale blue eyes were ice cold. I was, he said quietly. Victoria paused with her champagne glass halfway to her lips. You were what? Starting to care about them. In fact, I had already come to care about them a great deal. Something in his tone made Victoria set down her glass and study his face more carefully. Uncle Henry, you're not making sense. Those people were using you. No, Victoria. Henry's voice cut through her protests like a blade. You were using me. And you've been doing it for years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victoria's perfectly composed expression flickered, revealing a flash of something that might have been fear. I don't know what you mean, she said carefully. Don't you? Henry moved closer, and for the first time in months, his steps were sure and steady, with none of the hesitant shuffling of a blind man. Tell me, my dear niece, exactly how much have you been skimming from the family accounts? How many board meetings have you attended in my name, making decisions about my companies while I was supposedly too impaired to participate? Victoria's face went pale. Uncle Henry, your condition, Dr. Matthews said. Dr. Matthews said exactly what you paid him to say. Henry's laugh was bitter. Did you really think I wouldn't notice that my specialist drives a brand new Porsche? Or that his medical degree comes from a correspondence school in the Caribbean? The elegant facade Victoria had maintained for years began to crack. You don't understand the pressures I've been under, the decisions that had to be made. Someone needed to protect the family interests while you were. While I was what, Victoria? Grieving? Trying to find some meaning in my life after Margaret's death? Henry's voice rose, carrying decades of suppressed anger. Yes, I was lost. Yes, I was vulnerable. But instead of helping me heal, you saw an opportunity to manipulate me, to control me, to slowly steal everything my father and grandfather built. Victoria straightened, her chin lifting defiantly. Everything I did was for the family. Everything you did was for yourself. Henry slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, making Victoria jump. And when I finally found something that brought me joy, two young people who showed me genuine kindness without wanting anything in return, you couldn't stand it. You couldn't bear the thought that someone might care about me for who I am rather than what I own. Those people don't care about you. Victoria spat, her composure finally cracking completely. They're street trash, Uncle Henry. That girl works in a diner, for God's sake. She lives in a slum with that grubby little brother of hers. They have nothing to offer you. They offered me something you never have, Henry said quietly. They offered me love. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Victoria stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she struggled to process what she was hearing. Love? She finally repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. Uncle Henry, they barely know you. You've been playing this ridiculous charade, pretending to be helpless and confused, and you think that's love? They pity you. They feel sorry for the poor, blind old man who can't find his way home. Henry was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a sadness that cut deeper than anger. Do you know what Jaden said to me the first day I visited their apartment? He said that everyone needs a family, that he and Alina take care of each other because they're a team. An 8-year-old boy understood something about love and loyalty that you, at 35, have never grasped. That's beautiful, Uncle Henry, truly touching, Victoria said, her voice regaining some of its earlier venom. But it doesn't change the fact that I just saved you from a very expensive mistake. That girl would have bled you dry eventually. They always do. The only person who has been bleeding me dry is standing right in front of me. Victoria's face twisted with rage. Fine. Fine. You want to throw your money away on some street orphans, be my guest. But don't expect me to stand by and watch while you make a fool of yourself and drag the Whitmore name through the mud. The Whitmore name? Henry laughed, but there was no humor in it. Victoria, what you did today, publicly humiliating an innocent girl, turning an entire community against her, destroying her reputation and possibly her livelihood, that is what drags our family name through the mud. Not kindness. Not generosity. Not caring about people who have less than we do. Victoria grabbed her purse from the side table, her movements sharp and angry. I can see there's no reasoning with you in this state. When you come to your senses, when you realize what a mistake you're making, you'll thank me for protecting you. Victoria. Henry's voice stopped her at the doorway. I want you to understand something very clearly. What you did to Alina today was unforgivable. That girl has been nothing but kind to me, and you destroyed her reputation, humiliated her in front of her entire community, and broke the heart of a child who considered me family. What are you saying? Henry met her gaze with steely determination. I'm saying that you have made a very serious error in judgment. And I'm going to fix it. Victoria's laugh was shrill and desperate. How? By admitting you've been lying to everyone? By confessing that the great Henry Whitmore has been playing dress-up and pretending to be disabled? Do you have any idea how that would look? Honestly, my dear, Henry said, settling back into his chair with a calmness that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier anger. I don't particularly care how it looks. I care about doing what's right. Something you clearly know nothing about. After Victoria stormed out, Henry sat alone in the vast sitting room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege that had never felt more empty. In his mind, he could still see Alina's face in those final moments at the market, the confusion, the hurt, the desperate plea for someone, anyone, to believe in her innocence. And he had stood there in silence, a coward hiding behind dark glasses and a web of lies. For the first time since beginning his charade, Henry Whitmore was ashamed of himself. The apartment felt smaller than usual when Alina and Jaden finally made it home, both of them breathless from running in tears. Alina's hands shook as she turned the deadbolt, as if the thin wood door could somehow keep out the weight of an entire community's judgment. Outside, she could hear voices in the hallway, neighbors discussing the morning's events, their words carrying clearly through the cheap walls. Did you see that girl's face when they found the wallet? I always knew something was off about her. Too good to be true, you know? That poor old man. Thank God his niece was there to protect him. Alina pressed her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the worn carpet, finally allowing herself to fall apart. The sobs came in great, shuddering waves that seemed to tear through her chest like physical wounds. All those months of careful budgeting, of working double shifts, of maintaining her dignity despite their circumstances, undone in a single morning by a wallet she'd never touched. Jaden approached her cautiously, his small face streaked with tears and confusion. At 8 years old, he'd never seen his sister, his rock, his protector, his entire world, completely broken like this. Lena? His voice was barely above a whisper. Are you okay? She wanted to tell him yes, wanted to be strong for him the way she always had been. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she pulled him into her arms and held him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of his strawberry shampoo and the lingering smell of crayons that always seemed to cling to his clothes. I'm sorry, she whispered into his hair. I'm so sorry this is happening. But you didn't do anything wrong, Jaden said with the fierce certainty that only children possess. I know you didn't. You'd never steal from Grandpa Henry. You love him. The simple truth of his words made her cry harder. She did love Henry, had come to think of him as the grandfather either of them had ever known, the gentle presence that made their small world feel less lonely. And now everyone believed she'd betrayed that trust, used his vulnerability for her own gain. I know you know that, baby, she said, pulling back to look into his earnest brown eyes. But nobody else believes it. And that's really bad for us. Jaden's face crumpled with a new understanding. Despite his youth, he'd lived through enough uncertainty to recognize the signs of their world falling apart. Are they going to take me away? The question hit Alina like a physical blow. It was the fear that had lived in the back of her mind for 2 years, ever since she'd fought the court system for custody of her little brother after their parents' death. Social services had been skeptical of a 15-year-old's ability to care for a child, and it had taken months of supervised visits, home inspections, and character references to convince them she could provide a stable home. But now, with theft accusations hanging over her head, how long would it take for someone to make a phone call? How long before a caseworker showed up at their door, clipboard in hand, ready to place Jaden in foster care? For his own protection. No, she said firmly, though her voice shook with the effort. No, they're not going to take you away. I won't let that happen. But what if they try? Alina took his hands in hers, surprised by how steady her voice became when she needed to be strong for him. Then we'll fight. We've fought before, remember? When Mom and Dad died, and everyone said I was too young to take care of you. We proved them wrong then, and we'll prove them wrong now. Jaden nodded solemnly, but she could see the fear still lurking in his eyes. I don't understand why people are being so mean. Grandpa Henry is nice, and you're nice, so why can't you be friends? How could she explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes kindness was seen as weakness, that poverty made people suspicious, that the world was full of individuals who preferred ugly stories to beautiful truths? How could she tell him that their friendship with Henry had painted a target on their backs because someone else decided they didn't deserve such grace? Sometimes adults make things complicated when they don't need to be, she said instead. And sometimes people get scared when they see something they don't understand. Are you scared? The honest answer was yes. She was terrified. Terrified of losing her jobs, terrified of losing Jaden, terrified of spending the rest of her life branded as someone who preyed on vulnerable elderly people. But looking at her little brother's face, she knew she couldn't let that fear consume her. A little, she admitted. But being scared doesn't mean we give up. It means we have to be brave. They spent the rest of the afternoon curled together on their second-hand couch, watching cartoons on their small television and trying to pretend the world outside their apartment didn't exist. But reality had a way of intruding. The phone rang repeatedly. Reporters who'd somehow gotten word of the morning's incident, neighbors calling to voice their opinions, and one particularly nasty call from someone who suggested Alina should pack up and leave town before things get worse. By evening, Alina had unplugged the phone entirely. When Jaden finally fell asleep that night, exhausted by the day's emotional toll, Alina sat at their small kitchen table and stared at the stack of bills that seemed to have grown larger since morning. The rent notice was marked final, and she had exactly 4 days to come up with $600 or they'd be evicted. Murphy's Diner and the laundromat had both called that afternoon. Neither conversation had gone well. Look, Alina, Murphy had said, his Irish accent thick with discomfort. You know I think you're a good kid. But I got customers asking questions, you know? About whether it's safe to have someone with your situation handling their food. The laundromat owner had been more direct. I can't have drama in my business. Find somewhere else to work. 2 jobs lost in 1 day. Even if she found new employment immediately, it would take weeks to see a paycheck, and landlords weren't known for their patience with sob stories about false accusations. Alina put her head in her hands and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to give up. To pack their few belongings, take Jaden, and disappear into the vast anonymity of another city where no one knew their names or their story. They could start fresh, build new lives away from the poisonous whispers and hostile stares. But running would mean abandoning everything they'd built here, meager as it was. It would mean leaving Mrs. Patterson, who'd become like a grandmother to Jaden. It would mean giving up the small community they'd carved out for themselves, the familiar streets and friendly faces that had made this place feel like home. Most importantly, it would mean letting Victoria Whitmore win. The thought struck her like lightning, sudden and illuminating. This wasn't random bad luck or a series of unfortunate coincidences. Someone had orchestrated this destruction, the perfectly timed appearance of that elegant woman at the market, the wallet planted in her bag, the coordinated cruelty of the accusations. Someone wanted her gone, wanted her discredited and humiliated. But why? As she sat in the darkness of her small kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of their building settling around her, Alina made a decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. And she sure as hell wouldn't let anyone take Jaden away from her. She would fight back. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was fighting against. And that meant finding out who Victoria Whitmore really was, and why she'd gone to such elaborate lengths to destroy a teenage girl she'd never met. The game wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. 3 days after the market incident, Victoria Whitmore sat in her uncle's study, surrounded by stacks of legal documents that represented months of careful preparation. The mahogany desk that had once belonged to Henry's father now served as her war room, covered with papers that would finally give her complete control over the Whitmore fortune. She'd barely slept since their confrontation, her mind racing with contingency plans and damage control. Uncle Henry's unexpected clarity had been unsettling, but it didn't change the fundamental facts. He was still legally blind according to his medical records, still officially suffering from early-stage dementia according to Dr. Matthews' reports, and still vulnerable to claims of diminished capacity. The documents before her were masterpieces of legal manipulation. Powers of attorney that granted her authority over his financial decisions. Medical conservatorship papers that would place his healthcare choices in her hands. Asset protection agreements that would shield the family fortune from his impaired judgment and susceptibility to financial exploitation. All perfectly legal. All compassionate acts of a concerned niece protecting her elderly uncle's interests. The doorbell's chime echoed through the mansion, and Victoria smiled as she heard Patterson's footsteps crossing the marble foyer. Dr. Matthews had arrived right on schedule. "Dr. Matthews to see you, Miss Victoria," Patterson announced from the doorway, his British accent lending dignity to his obvious discomfort with the proceedings. "Thank you, Patterson. Please show him in." Dr. Richard Matthews entered the study with the nervous energy of a man who knew he was in too deep to back out now. At 52, he'd spent most of his career treating minor ailments in strip mall clinics, never quite successful enough to afford the lifestyle he craved. Victoria's offer 2 years ago had seemed like a gift from heaven, $50,000 to provide ongoing care for an elderly client, with the understanding that his professional opinions should emphasize the patient's declining cognitive function. He told himself it was harmless. Rich families dealt with these issues all the time, protecting aging patriarchs from their own poor judgment. If Henry Whitmore wanted to pretend he was more impaired than he actually was, who was Matthews to argue? The money had allowed him to upgrade his practice, buy the Porsche, take vacations in Europe. Now, looking at the cold calculation in Victoria's eyes, he wondered if he'd made a deal with the devil. "Sit down, doctor," Victoria said without preamble. "We have a problem." Matthews settled into the leather chair across from her, his hands fidgeting with his medical bag. "If this is about the Rodriguez girl, I heard what happened at the market. Terrible business, but it seems to have resolved itself." "It hasn't resolved anything," Victoria cut him off. "In fact, it's made things worse. My uncle has become unreasonable about the situation. He seems to think he can simply undo the damage to that girl's reputation, which would require him to reveal certain aspects of his condition that we've worked very hard to keep private. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to do." Victoria pulled a document from the stack and slid it across the desk. "I need you to sign this updated medical assessment. It recommends immediate conservatorship due to rapidly deteriorating cognitive function and episodes of severe confusion that pose a danger to both the patient and others." Matthews scanned the document, his face growing pale. "Victoria, this goes far beyond what we discussed. You're asking me to declare him mentally incompetent. I'm asking you to protect him from his own poor judgment, just as we've been doing all along." Victoria's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. "The only difference is that now it needs to be official. But he's not actually. I mean, during our sessions, he's been remarkably lucid. His memory is excellent, his reasoning is sound. If anything, he seems to be improving." "Dr. Matthews." Victoria's tone could have frozen water. Are you having second thoughts about our arrangement? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Matthews thought about his new practice, his expensive car, the mortgage on his upgraded home. He thought about what would happen if the medical board learned about their financial relationship, about the diagnoses he'd provided without proper examination, about the prescriptions he'd written for conditions that didn't exist. Of course not, he said finally. It's just that making such a dramatic change in his diagnosis so quickly might raise questions. Let me worry about questions, Victoria said, producing a pen and placing it beside the document. Your job is to provide the medical justification for protecting my uncle's assets from further exploitation. As Matthews reluctantly signed his name to the fraudulent assessment, Victoria felt a surge of satisfaction. With this document, she could have Uncle Henry declared legally incompetent within days. Any attempts he might make to clear that Rodriguez girl's name would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a man suffering from dementia. But she wasn't finished yet. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out her phone. I want you to listen to something. She pressed play on a recording app, and Henry's voice filled the room, not the hesitant, confused tones he'd used during his charade, but his normal, commanding presence. That girl has been nothing but kind to me, and you destroyed her reputation, humiliated her in front of her entire community, and broke the heart of a child who considered me family. Matthews looked confused. I don't understand. When was this recorded? 3 days ago, during our conversation about the market incident. Victoria's smile was predatory. The interesting thing is how clearly he speaks, how articulate he is, how completely in command of his faculties he sounds. Almost as if he's been pretending to be more impaired than he actually is. Understanding dawned on Matthew's face. You recorded your own uncle without his knowledge? I recorded a conversation with a man who has been lying to his medical team about the extent of his condition. Victoria corrected. A man who has been manipulating his doctors, his family, and his community by pretending to be helpless when he's actually quite capable of making his own decisions. She paused the recording and leaned forward. Now, what do you think would happen if this recording became public? What would people think about Henry Whitmore's character? About his honesty? About his fitness to manage his own affairs or make judgments about other people's character? Matthews stared at her in horror. You're blackmailing him. I'm protecting him, Victoria said smoothly, from the consequences of his own deception. You see, Doctor, if Uncle Henry tries to publicly defend that girl, if he attempts to clear her name or admit to his own lies, this recording will find its way to the press. Along with detailed documentation of his elaborate charade, his manipulation of medical professionals, and his questionable judgment in befriending people who were obviously taking advantage of his assumed vulnerability. The full scope of Victoria's trap became clear to Matthews. Henry couldn't reveal the truth about his condition without destroying his own credibility. He couldn't defend Alina without exposing his deception. And he couldn't contest the conservatorship without appearing to be exactly the kind of confused, manipulative elderly person who needed protection from his own poor judgment. This is monstrous, Matthews whispered. This is necessary, Victoria replied. Uncle Henry has allowed his emotions to cloud his judgment. He's forgotten that in our world, reputation and appearance matter more than sentiment and misguided compassion. I'm simply reminding him of that reality. She stood and gathered the signed documents, her movements crisp and businesslike. The conservatorship hearing is scheduled for Friday morning. I'll need you to testify about Uncle Henry's declining condition and the urgent need for intervention. Can I count on your continued cooperation, Doctor? Matthews nodded miserably, trapped by his own greed and complicity. After he left, Victoria sat alone in the study, feeling the weight of absolute power settling around her shoulders like an expensive coat. By Friday afternoon, she would control every aspect of Uncle Henry's life, his money, his medical care, his legal decisions, even his ability to communicate with the outside world. The Rodriguez girl would remain disgraced and unemployed, a cautionary tale about what happened to people who reached above their station. Uncle Henry would be safely contained, his dangerous impulses toward charity and human connection managed by more practical minds. And the Whitmore fortune would remain exactly where it belonged, under the control of someone smart enough to preserve it and ruthless enough to protect it from those who would squander it on undeserving causes. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and toasted her own reflection in the study's tall windows. She had won completely, and her victory was so elegant that Uncle Henry wouldn't even be able to fight back without destroying himself in the process. It was, she thought, a masterpiece of manipulation. The invitation appeared in Alina's mailbox on Thursday morning, a single cream-colored envelope that stood out starkly among the stack of overdue bills and eviction notices. Her hands trembled as she read the formal script. You are cordially invited to a community meeting to address recent misunderstandings in our neighborhood. Friday evening, 7 p.m., at the community center on Madison Avenue. Light refreshments will be provided. Sincerely, Henry Whitmore. Alina stared at the elegant paper, her mind racing. After 4 days of silence, of wondering if Henry believed the worst about her, here was proof that he was reaching out. But the formal tone, the careful wording of misunderstandings. It felt more like a legal summons than an invitation from a friend. What's that? Jaden asked, peering over her shoulder, as he balanced a bowl of cereal in his small hands. It's from Grandpa Henry, she said quietly. He wants to have a meeting about what happened. Jaden's face brightened for the first time since Saturday. Does that mean he believes you didn't steal his wallet? I don't know, baby. I hope so. The truth was, Alina wasn't sure what to expect. The invitation could be Henry's way of clearing her name publicly, or it could be his attempt to confront her about the theft in front of witnesses. Either way, she knew she had to go. Running away now would only confirm everyone's worst suspicions. By Friday evening, word of the mysterious meeting had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The community center, a modest brick building that usually hosted bingo nights and children's birthday parties, buzzed with curious energy as neighbors filed in, their faces mixing anticipation with barely concealed hostility. Alina arrived with Jaden at exactly 7 o'clock, her spine straight, and her chin lifted despite the way conversation stopped when people noticed her. She dressed carefully in her best blouse and skirt, the outfit she usually saved for court appearances and job interviews, determined to face whatever was coming with dignity. Mrs. Green spotted them first and made her way over, her weathered face creased with concern. Alina, honey, are you sure you should be here? Some of these people are saying pretty harsh things about you. I need to be here, Alina replied softly. Whatever Mr. Henry has to say, I want to hear it. The center continued to fill as the clock ticked past 7. Mr. Cole arrived wearing his best suit, his chest puffed with self-importance, as neighbors patted his shoulder and praised him for keeping an eye on things. Mrs. Milano came reluctantly, her kind face troubled by the whole situation. The Garcias whispered in rapid Spanish near the refreshment table, casting suspicious glances in Alina's direction. At exactly 7:15, Victoria Whitmore made her entrance. She swept into the community center like a queen granting an audience to peasants, her designer dress and perfectly styled hair marking her as distinctly out of place among the working-class neighbors. Behind her came a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone and glancing toward the exits. That's Uncle Henry's doctor, Victoria announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the room. Dr. Matthews. He's here because of some concerns about Uncle Henry's recent behavior and decision-making. Alina felt eyes settle in her stomach. This wasn't going to be the vindication she'd hoped for. Victoria positioned herself near the front of the room, her presence commanding attention even from those who clearly found her off-putting. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, she said, her voice warm with false sincerity. My uncle specifically requested that this community be here to witness. Well, we'll let him explain. The community center's main door opened, and Henry Whitmore entered. But this wasn't the confused, hesitant man Alina had come to know and care about. This Henry moved with purpose, his white cane held confidently, his posture straight and commanding. Even behind his dark glasses, there was an authority about him that made the room fall silent. Good evening, he said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the space. Thank you all for accepting my invitation on such short notice. He walked to the front of the room, and Alina noticed that his steps were sure and steady, with none of the careful shuffle she'd grown accustomed to. Something was different about him tonight, something that made her pulse quicken with hope and dread in equal measure. I asked you here tonight because there are things that need to be said, Henry continued, his hands folded atop his cane. Truths that need to be told. Wrongs that need to be made right. Victoria stepped forward, her smile bright but her eyes cold. Uncle Henry, perhaps we should let Dr. Matthews explain the situation first. About your condition, your recent confusion. There will be no need for that, Victoria, Henry said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Mr. Cole stood up from his seat in the third row, his chest puffed with righteous indignation. Now see here, Mr. Whitmore, I've been documenting that girl's behavior for weeks. I've got notes, photographs, witness statements. Ah yes, Mr. Cole. Henry turned toward him, and something in his tone made the older man's confidence falter. I'm very interested in discussing your documentation. Tell me, how much did my niece pay you for those observations? The question hit the room like a thunderclap. Cole's face went red then pale. That's not. I was protecting you from. From what, Mr. Cole? From kindness? From friendship? From the simple human decency that your neighbors showed me when I was lost and confused? Victoria's composure began to crack around the edges. Uncle Henry, you're not thinking clearly. Dr. Matthews, perhaps you should. Dr. Matthews, Henry said, turning toward the nervous man in the expensive suit. Tell me, what exactly is your medical opinion of my current mental state? Dr. Matthews looked desperately between Henry and Victoria, sweat beading on his forehead. Well, given your recent diagnosis of dementia, and the episodes of confusion. What episodes of confusion would those be, doctor? The room was dead silent now, everyone hanging on every word of this strange confrontation. Alina found herself holding her breath, sensing that something monumental was about to happen but unable to predict what it would be. Victoria stepped between Henry and Dr. Matthews, her voice sharp with authority. That's enough. Uncle Henry, you're clearly having another episode. Dr. Matthews has already signed the papers recommending immediate conservatorship for your own protection. Has he now? Henry's smile was thin and cold. How interesting. And when exactly did this medical evaluation take place, doctor? Because according to my calendar, we haven't met in over a month. Dr. Matthews looked like he might faint. Victoria's face had gone marble pale, her perfect composure finally beginning to crumble. Uncle Henry, she said desperately, you're embarrassing yourself. These people don't understand your condition, your vulnerability to manipulation. You're right, Victoria, Henry said, reaching up to remove his dark glasses. These people don't understand. But they're about to. He lifted the glasses from his face and looked directly at Alina across the crowded room. His pale blue eyes were clear, focused, and completely free of the confusion she'd grown accustomed to seeing there. Because I'm not blind, he said simply. I never was. The community center erupted into chaos. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by a cacophony of confused voices as neighbors struggled to process what they'd just heard. Henry Whitmore, the helpless, confused old man they'd watched Alina guide across streets and through stores, stood before them with perfect vision, his pale blue eyes clear and sharp as he surveyed the crowd. That's impossible. Someone shouted from the back. We all saw you with that cane, those dark glasses. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see, Henry replied calmly, setting his white cane aside with deliberate ceremony. For the past 3 months, I've been conducting an experiment. A test, if you will, to discover what kind of people lived in this community. To see who would show kindness to a vulnerable stranger, and who would ignore someone in need. Victoria's face had gone ashen, but she rallied quickly, her voice sharp with desperation. Uncle Henry, you're having another episode. Dr. Matthews, please tell these people about his condition. Dr. Matthews won't be telling anyone anything," Henry interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. "Because Dr. Matthews is a fraud, and we both know it." Henry walked to the center of the room, his movements fluid and confident. Every eye followed him, and Alina found herself gripping Jaden's hand so tightly the boy winced. 3 years ago," Henry continued, "my wife Margaret passed away from cancer. For months afterward I felt lost, purposeless. I began to wonder if anyone in my life cared about me as a person, or if they simply saw me as a source of wealth and influence. So I decided to find out." He gestured toward Victoria, whose perfectly composed mask was finally slipping completely. "My dear niece here was more than happy to help me maintain the illusion of blindness and confusion. She arranged for the fake medical consultations, the fraudulent diagnoses, the careful documentation of my supposed decline. What she didn't realize was that I was documenting her activities as well." Henry pulled a small recording device from his jacket pocket. "Including our conversation just 3 days ago, where she confessed to paying Mr. Cole to spy on Alina, to spreading lies throughout this community, and to framing an innocent girl with planted evidence." Mr. Cole shot to his feet, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. "Now see here, that's not, I was protecting the community from." "From what, Mr. Cole?" Henry's voice cut through the man's protests like steel. "From a 17-year-old girl who worked 2 jobs to support her little brother? From a young woman who helped a confused stranger cross the street without asking for anything in return? From someone who showed me more genuine kindness in one afternoon than my own family had shown me in years?" He pressed play on the recording device, and Victoria's voice filled the stunned silence. "That girl would have bled you dry eventually. They always do. I just saved you from a very expensive mistake. These people are street trash, Uncle Henry. That girl works in a diner, for God's sake." The room erupted again, but this time the anger was directed at Victoria. Mrs. Milano stepped forward, her weathered face flushed with outrage. "You did this? You made us believe that sweet girl was a thief?" Victoria tried to maintain her composure, but her voice cracked with panic. "You don't understand the pressures I was under, the decisions that had to be made. Someone needed to protect the family assets while he was playing these ridiculous games. The only person threatening the family assets," Henry said coldly, "was you." He pulled out another device, a sleek tablet, and turned it toward the crowd. "For 2 years, Victoria has been systematically embezzling from family accounts. Board meetings attended in my name, contracts signed with my forged signature, business decisions made while I was supposedly too impaired to participate. Dr. Matthews here provided the medical documentation to support her claims of my incompetence, in exchange for $50,000 and a promise to keep quiet about his fraudulent medical degree." Dr. Matthews looked like he was about to vomit. I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Henry said firmly. "You both saw my grief and vulnerability as an opportunity to steal from me. The difference is that Alina Rodriguez saw those same circumstances and chose to offer comfort and friendship instead." He turned to look directly at Alina, who sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face. "My dear, would you and Jaden please join me?" On trembling legs, Alina stood and walked to the front of the room with Jaden clinging to her hand. The hostile faces that had glared at her for days now looked ashamed, embarrassed, some openly crying at the realization of what they'd done. "This young woman," Henry said, placing a gentle hand on Alina's shoulder, "never once asked me for money. Never once suggested I was anything other than a lonely old man who got confused sometimes. She shared her food with me, invited me into her home, let her little brother call me Grandpa, and treated me with a dignity and respect that my own family couldn't be bothered to show." Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Uncle Henry, even if what you're saying is true, you can't seriously be considering." "Considering what, Victoria?" "Ensuring that Alina's reputation is restored? Making certain that everyone in this room understands she is completely innocent of any wrongdoing?" "Yes, I am most certainly considering that." Henry's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the room. 3 days ago, my niece publicly humiliated this girl, destroyed her reputation, cost her both of her jobs, and turned an entire community against her. All to protect her ability to steal from me and maintain control over assets that were never hers to begin with. Mrs. Green stood up, tears in her eyes. Alina, honey, I am so sorry. We should have known better. We should have trusted what we knew about your character instead of listening to lies and gossip. One by one, other neighbors began to stand, offering apologies, expressing shame at their behavior. Mrs. Milano rushed forward to embrace Elena, sobbing in rapid Italian. Even some of the people who had been most hostile looked stricken with remorse. But not everyone was ready to accept the truth. Mr. Cole, his face still red with indignation, pointed an accusatory finger at Henry. This is all very convenient, isn't it? Now that you've been caught in your own lies, you expect us to believe this elaborate story about testing the community? How do we know this isn't just another manipulation? Henry smiled, not the confused, tentative expression Alina had grown accustomed to, but the confident smile of a man who had anticipated every possible objection. An excellent question, Mr. Cole. Patterson? The elderly butler stepped into the room from a side entrance, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of formal expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, Patterson announced in his crisp British accent, I am Patterson Williams, Mr. Whitmore's personal assistant and the executor of his estate. For the past 3 months, I have been documenting Mr. Whitmore's activities as part of what we have termed the Community Character Assessment Project. I have video evidence of every interaction, audio recordings of every conversation, and detailed reports on the behavior of every individual involved. He opened the briefcase and pulled out several thick folders. Including comprehensive documentation of Miss Whitmore's embezzlement scheme, Mr. Cole's paid surveillance activities, Dr. Matthews' fraudulent medical practice, and most importantly, Miss Rodriguez's consistent acts of kindness towards someone she believed was vulnerable and alone. Victoria finally cracked completely. This is insane! She screamed, her polished veneer dissolving into raw panic. You can't do this to me! I'm family! I was protecting the business, protecting your reputation. You were protecting your own greed, Henry said quietly, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a knife. And in the process, you revealed exactly who you really are. He turned back to the crowd, his expression grave but determined. I asked you all here tonight because I wanted you to understand what really happened. Alina Rodriguez is not a thief. She's not a manipulator. She's a remarkable young woman who showed genuine kindness to a stranger, and she's been punished for it by people who should have known better. The room fell silent except for the sound of quiet weeping from several neighbors who were still processing the magnitude of their mistake. Henry looked directly at Elena, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. My dear, you and Jaden showed me something I thought I'd lost forever. You reminded me that there are still good people in this world, people who choose kindness over cynicism, love over suspicion. You saved me in ways you'll never fully understand. Jaden, who had been unusually quiet throughout the entire revelation, suddenly broke free from his sister's grip and threw his arms around Henry's waist. I knew you could see, Grandpa Henry, he said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. Your eyes were too kind to be broken. 6 months later, the spring sun streamed through the tall windows of the Rodriguez family's new home in Lincoln Park, casting golden rectangles across hardwood floors that Alina still couldn't quite believe belonged to them. The 3-bedroom house wasn't a mansion. Henry had insisted on something comfortable but not ostentatious. But to Alina and Jaden, it might as well have been a palace. Lena! Grandpa Henry's here. Jaden called from the front window, where he'd been watching for their weekly visitor with the excitement that never seemed to diminish. Alina smiled as she set down her college textbook, Introduction to Social Work, her favorite class this semester, and went to open the door. Henry stood on their front porch, no longer carrying the white cane that had been part of his disguise, his genuine smile brighter than the afternoon sun. How are my favorite people today? He asked, stepping into their home with the ease of someone who truly belonged there. The legal aftermath of that night at the community center had been swift and decisive. Victoria had been arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence Patterson had collected over 3 months, combined with the financial forensics Henry's legitimate lawyers had conducted, painted a damning picture of systematic theft that stretched back nearly 3 years. She was currently serving a 5-year sentence in federal prison, her assets frozen to pay restitution to the family accounts she'd raided. Dr. Matthews had lost his medical license and faced his own criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. The medical board's investigation had revealed a pattern of fraudulent diagnoses and illegal prescriptions that affected dozens of patients beyond Henry. His expensive lifestyle had crumbled as quickly as it had been built. Mr. Cole, meanwhile, had become something of a pariah in the neighborhood. When word spread about his role as Victoria's paid informant, spreading lies about an innocent girl for money, most of his neighbors stopped speaking to him entirely. He'd eventually moved away, unable to bear the weight of community judgment. "How was school today, young scholar?" Henry asked Jaden, who was proudly wearing his Lincoln Elementary Student Council pin on his shirt. "Great. We're planning the spring carnival, and I get to be in charge of the games booth. And guess what? Tommy Williams apologized to me again today. I think he feels really bad about what he said before." Henry nodded approvingly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I'm glad he's learning that lesson." The community's response to the revelation had been overwhelmingly positive, though it had taken time for some neighbors to overcome their shame. Mrs. Milano had offered Alina her old job back, along with a raise and flexible hours to accommodate her college schedule. Mrs. Green had become like a grandmother to Jaden, often babysitting when Alina had evening classes. Even Mrs. Patterson, their former upstairs neighbor, had apologized tearfully for not speaking up more forcefully in Alina's defense. "How are your classes going, my dear?" Henry asked as they settled in the comfortable living room that Alina had decorated with a mix of their old belongings and new pieces Henry had insisted on buying. "Really well," Alina replied, her eyes lighting up. "Professor Martinez says I have a natural aptitude for advocacy work. She thinks I should consider specializing in family services, helping kids who are in situations like Jaden and I were." Henry's expression grew soft with pride. "That sounds perfect for you. You have a gift for seeing the best in people and fighting for those who can't fight for themselves." The trust fund Henry had established for their education and living expenses had been life-changing, but it was the emotional support that had meant even more. He'd become the grandfather figure either of them had ever known, attending Jaden's school plays and Alina's academic award ceremonies with the devoted enthusiasm of a true family member. "Can we show him the surprise now?" Jaden whispered loudly to his sister. Alina grinned. "I think we've kept him waiting long enough." Jaden disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a large sheet of drawing paper, his face glowing with excitement. "I made this for you, Grandpa Henry." Henry accepted the artwork with the reverence reserved for masterpieces. The crayon drawing showed 3 figures standing in front of a house: a tall woman with long dark hair, a small boy with a gap-toothed grin, and an elderly man with kind eyes and no dark glasses. Above them, written in Jaden's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Our family." For a moment, Henry couldn't speak. The old grief for Margaret, while never fully healed, had been joined by something new and wonderful, the joy of being part of a family again, of having people who loved him not for his wealth or status, but simply for who he was. "It's beautiful, Jaden," he managed finally. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." As evening approached and they shared dinner around their small kitchen table, Henry reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all together. His test had been designed to find one person capable of genuine kindness, but it had given him so much more. It had given him a family, a purpose, and a renewed faith in the fundamental goodness that could still be found in the world. Later, as Henry prepared to leave, Alina walked him to the door. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said that night at the community center. About us saving you." "Oh?" Henry paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I think we saved each other," she said simply. Henry smiled, remembering words he'd spoken months ago in anger and desperation, words that had turned out to be more prophetic than he'd realized. "You saved me when everyone else walked past," he said, echoing that earlier sentiment. "Now it's my turn to save you." "You already have," Alina replied, gesturing toward their comfortable home, toward Jaden's laughter coming from the living room, toward the college textbooks that represented her bright future. "Every single day, you save us all over again." As Henry walked down their tree-lined street toward his car, he could hear Jaden's voice calling from the window. "See you next week, Grandpa Henry! Don't get lost!" Henry chuckled, remembering all the times he'd pretended to be lost, confused, helpless. The irony wasn't lost on him. In pretending to need saving, he'd found the people who would actually save him in return. The game had ended months ago, but the love it had revealed would last forever. At home that evening, Jaden carefully tacked his drawing to the refrigerator next to his spelling tests and Alina's Dean's List certificate. In the warm light of their kitchen, the three crayon figures looked exactly like what they were, a family that had found each other against all odds, bound not by blood but by something stronger, the choice to love and be loved in return. Outside, the Chicago skyline sparkled with possibility, and somewhere in the city, other lonely people were walking past other strangers in need, most of them too busy or too afraid to stop and help. But not all of them. And that, Henry knew, made all the difference.